They told us paper was just for writing. They didn't tell us it was for building. Welcome back to the archives of the pivot paper. I've got a story for you today about a woman who had to redraw her own map. It was 2015, a year that felt like a long, breathless afternoon. Iris was 52. She was the bridge, the center of the wheel, the one who held the weight of two worlds in her hands. In one hand, she held the tuition statements for a daughter who was becoming a woman. In the other, she held the mounting pharmacy receipts for a father who was slowly, quietly returning to the earth. She was the sandwich, compressed by love and by the silent, crushing expectation that she would simply manage. Iris lived in a house that smelled of lavender oil and antiseptic. The scent of beeswax from her mother's old furniture fought with the sharp chemical reality of her father's decline. Every morning she would wake up at 5 a.m., not to build her empire, but to balance the ledgers of people who could no longer speak for themselves. She was a vice president by day, but by night she was a nurse, a bookkeeper, a ghost. She began to notice the small leaks first. $100 here for a specialized walker, $2,000 there for the home health aide who didn't take insurance. She didn't want to bother her siblings. They had their own lives. She didn't want to dip into her father's meager pension. He had worked 40 years for that pittance. So she reached into her own 401k. She told herself it was a loan from her future self, a temporary bridge across a rising tide. But 2015 was a year of floods. By the time the leaves began to turn charcoal and gold, Iris realized she had depleted $40,000 of her own retirement capital. $40,000 of invisible labor that had no name on the family ledger. She was building a sanctuary for her father and a future for her daughter, but she was dismantling her own foundation to do it. She sat at her kitchen table one Tuesday evening, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm against the glass. The coldness of the marble counter seeped through her sleeves. She looked at her hands. They were stained with the ink of other people's problems. She realized that if she were to fall tomorrow, there would be no paper trail to protect her. Her labor was free in the eyes of the law, which meant her sacrifice was technically a gift. In the eyes of the bank, she was a liability. She was losing her sovereignty in the name of service. She had spent 15 years caring for everyone's heartbeat except her own. What she didn't know then, what the archives would later reveal, was that there was a mechanism hidden in the law, a way to turn her service into a secured interest. But she would have to stop being just a daughter and start being the architect. The crisis of 2015 wasn't the illness in the guest room, it was the silence in the bank account. Iris realized that family is a beautiful word, but contract is the one that keeps the lights on. She looked at the stack of invoices on her table, the physical evidence of her own erasure. She saw the dates, the amounts, and the names, and then she saw the truth. She was subsidizing a legacy that would eventually be split among people who hadn't spent a single night in the lavender-scented air. If the house were sold after her father passed, her siblings would receive an equal share of the equity that she had personally preserved with her own retirement funds. She was paying for her own disinheritance. The realization felt like a sudden drop in temperature. She put down the tea. It had gone cold. She picked up a fountain pen, a heavy silver instrument that felt like a weapon. She began to write a different story. She was about to discover the paper that would reimburse her spirit and her savings. She was about to learn that love is the motive, but the ledger is the protection. To be continued. In Part 2, we look at the document that turned a gift into a debt and a daughter into an authorized agent. Iris didn't have an epiphany under a sunbeam. Her realization came in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, standing in the aisle of a local pharmacy holding a prescription bottle that cost more than her first car. She looked at her reflection in the glass of the refrigerated section. She saw a woman who was disappearing, a woman whose professional brilliance was being traded dollar by dollar for the comfort of others. She realized that while she was busy being the good daughter, she was failing the woman who would one day be 75 and living in Iris's own shoes. She was failing her future self. She went home and did what most women are afraid to do. She separated her heart from her balance sheet. She sat at her mahogany desk, the grandfather clock ticking with the rhythmic persistence of a heartbeat. She opened her laptop and began what I call a life capital audit. She didn't just look at the bank statements. She looked at the opportunity cost, the 401k contributions she had skipped, the compound interest she had murdered to pay for a ramp on the back porch, the 3 years of raises she hadn't negotiated because she was too tired to be ambitious at the office. The math was brutal. It was cold. It was precise. She had spent over $60,000 of her own wealth in 3 years, but on the family deed, her interest remained exactly the same as her brother's, and he hadn't visited since Thanksgiving of 2013. Iris reached for a heavy leather-bound ledger, the kind with the thick, cream-colored pages that feel like they hold the weight of history. She felt the texture of the spine, the scent of aged paper and beeswax rising to meet her. In 2015, the digital revolution was supposed to make everything easier, but Iris knew that for the elders, if it wasn't on paper, it didn't exist. She began to document her invisible labor. She logged every hour of caregiving, every mile driven, every copay covered. She wasn't being petty, she was being forensic. She realized that her family saw her service as a moral duty, but the law, if structured correctly, saw it as a service contract. But a ledger is just a diary of loss until it is transformed into a legal instrument. Iris knew that simply asking her siblings for help would lead to a dinner table war. She needed a mechanism that spoke for her, a mechanism that would ensure her retirement was replenished from the very estate she was currently preserving. She was about to move from volunteer to vendor. In the quiet of that study, the asset architect began to construct the shield. The strategy was the personal care agreement, a formal written contract between Iris and her father. In 2015, these were the quiet sovereignty tools used by those who understood that the sandwich generation needs more than just empathy, they need equity. The agreement stated that Iris was to be compensated for her caregiving services at a fair market rate. But here was the pivot. Because her father didn't have the liquid cash to pay her today, the debt was to be secured against the equity of the family home. It was a deferred compensation model. Every hour she spent managing his care became a documented lien on the estate. When the house would eventually be sold, Iris would be paid first as a creditor of the estate before the remaining inheritance was split. Do you see the architecture? She wasn't taking from her siblings. She was stopping the theft of her own retirement. She was ensuring that the $40,000 she had pulled from her 401k would find its way back home with interest. She felt the weight of the fountain pen in her hand. It no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a lever. She was no longer just the daughter who did it all. She was the project manager of the legacy. She was the authorized agent of her own survival. But a contract requires a signature, and a signature requires a conversation. To be continued. In Part 3, we enter the room where the old guard meets the new strategy. We see what happens when Iris presents the sandwich protocol to the family and the legal reckoning that follows. The Sunday dinner table was a theater of habit. The scent of rosemary chicken and warm cornbread filled the air. The smells of family that usually masked the rot of entitlement. Iris sat at the foot of the table, watching her siblings. They were comfortable, they were relaxed, they were secure in the knowledge that Iris was at the helm, which meant they didn't have to look at the storm. In 2015, we were taught that talking about money at the dinner table was gauche, but the asset architect knows that silence is the fertilizer of resentment. Iris didn't bring a grievance to the table. She brought a binder. She placed the estate protocol binder on the linen tablecloth, the heavy thud of it silencing the clink of silverware. "I am no longer the family's contingency plan," she said, her voice a rhythmic, intentional hum. She wasn't angry. Anger is for the weak. Precision is for the powerful. She explained the personal care agreement. She showed them the ledger of the last 3 years, the invisible labor now made visible in black and white. The room went cold. Her brother spoke of family duty. Her sister spoke of sacrifice. They were using the language of the 1950s to try and manage a woman in 2015. But Iris had already performed the exorcism. She had killed the good daughter who asked for permission. She replaced her with the trustee who demanded structure. The formalizing of the family ledger was a surgical act. Iris didn't just present a contract. She presented a memorandum of understanding to be recorded against the deed of the house. This was the institutional shift. She moved the care of her father from a social obligation to a legal liability. She introduced the concept of quantum meruit, the legal principle that no one should be unjustly enriched by another's labor. If she was the one preserving the value of the home, then she was the one with the primary claim to its equity. She watched as her siblings realized that the inheritance they were counting on was actually a debt they owed to her. But the reckoning wasn't just about the money. It was about the transfer of authority. Iris wasn't just seeking reimbursement, she was seeking the liquidity shield. She was about to ensure that even if the house never sold, her retirement would be made whole through the power of attorney she was about to activate. The asset architect knows that a contract is only as strong as its enforcement. Iris had her father sign a durable power of attorney that specifically authorized her to pay herself from his accounts for the care provided. But the true key to the kingdom was the caregiver lien. By recording her personal agreement as a lien against the property, she made her interest senior to any unsecured claims. In the eyes of the law, Iris became a secured creditor. She was no longer waiting for a thank you or a handout from her siblings. She had built a structure where the house itself would pay her back before a single penny was distributed to the beneficiaries who hadn't done the work. She reached into her bag and pulled out a heavy brass notary seal. The weight of it on the table was a signal that the archival era of guesswork was over. She had the signatures, she had the dates, she had the law. She looked at her siblings, not with malice, but with a clinical, restrained dignity. "I am securing the house," she told them, "and in doing so, I am securing myself." She was no longer the sandwich. She was the crust. She was the structure. She was the one who decided how the bread was sliced. The dinner ended not with a fight, but with a profound, heavy silence. The siblings left the table realizing that Iris was no longer their safety net. They were their lender. But the final piece of the sandwich protocol wasn't about the past. It was about the intergenerational future. To be continued. In Part 4, we see the final legacy. We see how Iris used the caregiver lien to not only save her retirement, but to teach her daughter how to never be sandwiched again. The house in the autumn of 2015 was different. The lavender was still there, and the grandfather clock still kept its steady, rhythmic pace, but the tension that had once lived in the floorboards had evaporated. Iris sat in the garden, watching the golden hour light play across the stone path. She was no longer running. She was standing still on ground that she had finally fortified. In her lap lay a final, recorded copy of the Memorandum of Agreement. It was a humble-looking document, but to Iris, it was a masterpiece. It was the paper that had stopped the leak in her life. By the end of 2015, Iris's 401k wasn't just a dream again, it was a growing entity. Through the structure she had built, her father's estate was now reimbursing her for the co-pays, the aids, and the time. She was no longer paying for his dignity with her own poverty. She realized that the greatest gift she gave her father wasn't just the care, it was the order. She had removed the burden of guilt and replaced it with a professional exchange. Her father, in his moments of clarity, looked at her not with the eyes of a patient, but with the pride of a man who knew his daughter was a strategist. Iris reached out and touched the rough, cool stone of the garden bench. The scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney drifted through the air, a tactile reminder that winter was coming, but she was prepared. She called her daughter over to sit with her. She didn't show her how to change a bandage or how to hide a medical bill. She showed her the ledger. She showed her the caregiver lien. She taught her that love without a contract is a risk, but love with an architecture is a legacy. "We are a people of high service," Iris whispered, her voice rhythmic and slow. "But we must also be a people of high security." She was passing down more than just money. She was passing down the sandwich protocol, the understanding that you never have to choose between your elders and your endgame. Her daughter looked at the ivory paper and the heavy brass seal. She saw that her mother wasn't just managing, she was ruling. The cycle of the invisible servant ended with Iris. The archives will show that 2015 was a pivotal time of digital transition, but for Iris, it was a time of domestic reckoning. She had moved her labor from the shadows to the sheet. She had secured her place in the family history as the one who didn't just carry the weight, but the one who designed the bridge. She looked at the house, the asset she was protecting, and she smiled. She was no longer a guest in her father's legacy. She was the architect of her own. It's time to stop being a guest in your own life and start being the architect. Sign your own pivot. Subscribe to the paper. Legacy is not what we leave behind. It is what we put in place. You have heard the story. You have seen the pivot. Now the drafting table is yours. If you are ready to move from equitable interest to legal sovereignty, join us in the vault. Secure the paper. Protect the lineage. I am the asset architect, and this is the pivot paper.